Hello everyone. This week we're going to cover First Nations education funding in Canada. Because it's funded federally, it's going to cover Canada, but we're really speaking about Saskatchewan for this presentation. And because we covered post-secondary funding a couple weeks ago, this is largely going to be about K-12 schools in the province. We know that all students in Saskatchewan are entitled to a free education. If they're residents here, they get educated for free, and this includes provincial and First Nations children. Most children attend provincial schools, and we also know that the funding for these schools is provided by the province for 60% and by property taxes. But many of our students also attend First Nation or band schools, and these schools are located on First Nations reserves in Saskatchewan. All band schools, so all students who attend schools on reserve, are funded federally. The reason they're funded federally is situated in the treaties, also in our Constitution Act, as well as in the Indian Act. The statement in the Constitution is that federal government is responsible for Indians and land reserved for Indians. And in the Indian Act, education is mentioned as First Nations education or band-controlled education for First Nations students. And this applies always only to students who attend First Nation schools on reserve. There are two different ways that First Nation students are funded. If these students attend school on reserve, they are funded through the federal government. But as soon as a First Nation student attends a provincial school, these students are funded, if they're traveling from the First Nation to the provincial school, they're funded by the First Nation. But if the student doesn't live on a First Nation and lives on non-First Nation land, they're funded by the province like anyone else. There are different funding arrangements for First Nation schools, and this causes a whole bunch of controversy in our province. It's a completely different funding mechanism, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. But largely, most of the confusion around how First Nations schools are funded is a result of the actual funding agreements. Every single reserve has a different funding agreement that's negotiated separately with their own INAC, or I guess it's not INAC anymore, with their own ANSI rep. And these funding arrangements are supposed to reflect the actual needs of the children on reserve and the negotiations that they've made with the federal government through ANSI. A lot of these funding arrangements are historical. If the band is deemed by the federal government to manage their money properly, then they might get a lot more latitude in their funding. So they would get something like a block funding arrangement, perhaps that stems over 5 years. If the arrangement is more rigid for whatever reasons, the band might have a very fixed funding arrangement where there's not a lot of movement between budget lines. So every single one of these arrangements are negotiated separately, again, in the hopes to meet the needs of the First Nation school. And this causes a lot of controversy, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Also, every First Nation school is audited by the ANSI representative. Therefore, every October, I believe it is, and into November, a system of auditing comes into play where students are physically counted, and if those students are absent or haven't been attending, money is pulled away from the budget. This auditing process also happens in the spring. Therefore, that causes a lot of confusion as well, depending on when the funding amounts are calculated. I'm going to click on this link, which I'll give you the link to it in our announcements this week. This is an excellent website by ANSI, Aboriginal and Northern, I don't know what I just did there, Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada. It's a frequently asked questions website, and it explains the different grant approaches. And I think it's really valuable to go through this as a finance learner, as a First Nations funding learner. Again, just like I talked about earlier, the approach that each band receives is dependent on whatever arrangements. And you'll see here there's some different arrangements: set contribution, fixed, flexible, and block. And it's quite interesting to read about what all of those are. And then on this chart, funding approaches and key elements, it actually talks about what that type of funding arrangement allows the band to do. So again, if you look at set contribution right here, the funds are expected to be expended as exactly identified in the funding agreement, and it can't be redirected. Therefore, if the funding isn't spent there, it actually has to be returned. Flexible, this has some carry forward. Sometimes you can actually use some of that money for different line items. And then block is probably the most flexible because these are given in long-term agreements. If a reserve has block funding, usually all of the items in that block funding arrangement are given, and then the band has the discretion to move money wherever they need. The education amount will be given at the same time as the health amount, at the same time as the housing amount. So all of the monies that are provided by the government are given at once, and the band can move monies from one fund to the other. Also, it's interesting to know, it's probably important to know, that education is usually the largest portion of that block. And so I have had financial officers of reserve schools mention that if there ever is a threat to any funding block, it's usually to the education one because it's the largest. So if a band might need more money for another pocket, sometimes it can be taken away from education, and that is very different from fixed funding or set contributions. So this website is actually quite informative, and there's a few additional Q&As, so I recommend that you take a look at that. Again, the link will be provided in our announcements. I'm going to give you an example of how one of the transfer agreements, the funding arrangements, can look. And if you think back to when we went through the education funding document, you can maybe make some comparisons to this. So for a flexible agreement, the term consists of a basic instructional component, a core curriculum component, a high school component, admin, mature student component, and you can see all the funds there, enhanced teacher salary component, and a special ed component. These types of agreements, the fixed, the flexible, the block, never include capital funding agreements. So something can be read into the article that was provided last week by one of our colleagues in this class, where criticisms are given about the capital funding that's provided for First Nation schools, and that First Nation schools are 5 years behind the norm in the province. It's really important to know that capital funding, like in the provincial system, is separate from the agreements that we're talking about here. There's also proposal-driven funding. Now, I know that when we talked about post-secondary education about a month ago, we talked about the Indian Student Studies Program, I believe the ISSP. That is funding that actual individual students can apply for in order to go to post-secondary education. But for K-12, First Nations can also apply for a variety of funds. And what I've done here is I've picked probably the two most popular, the two largest blocks of money. There's a New Paths funding, and that is a kind of a professional development fund. It assists in professional development, I would say the most, partnerships and school-to-work transitions, and then the First Nations Student Success Program. And many parallels have been made and can be made with the First Nation Student Success Program and our continuous improvement framework in the province. So it's meant to target literacy, numeracy, school improvement plans, and things like that. And school divisions can apply with projects and with ideas, not school divisions, sorry, bands, can apply with projects and ideas to get this additional funding. There's quite a lot of momentum here, and it's very, very common to see presentations about this type of thing when you go to conferences and things like that. Oh, here's what I was talking about a little bit earlier. There's the FNSSP and then the ISSP, and just a little bit of detail there for post-secondary. So I talked a little bit about the funding mechanisms being flexible, fixed, block, that type of thing. Um, I want to talk a little bit about the auditing system and the nominal roll. When you read articles about First Nations funding, often the nominal roll comes up, and it is a critical document because it is used as the census. It is used as the basis or the grounding of how funds and funding is distributed on First Nations. The nominal roll is actually basically that. It is a roll call. It is a daily register, I guess, of all students. The nominal roll for a First Nations school happens on a daily basis, where the nominal roll for a provincial school happens the last school day in September of every single year. So for provincial schools, when that census is taken at the end of September, that determines your budget for the entire year. And this has a dramatic effect on First Nations schools. You can appreciate, for example, in September that a First Nations school, let's say, has an enrollment of 150. So they would hire the certain number of teachers that would be appropriate for 150 students. But if the enrollment goes down in that school, they still have these numbers of teachers, but they have fewer students, therefore their funding gets cut. So they have the responsibility to continue to pay this teacher or actually get rid of them depending on the contract arrangements, and this causes a lot of problems. I just talked about this slide. The nominal roll is an actual count of students living on reserve and attending that school, and it's used to determine how much money each band will get. And it is very, very flexible or sensitive. It's a managerial tool as well. It includes residency information, special needs information, and teacher pay and pay scales. Sometimes statistics are also pulled from the nominal roll for graduation rates and whatever else. So a little bit of information about the nominal roll. To be considered a full-time student, you have to be enrolled and entered on the classroom register. And October 15th is the first magic day. Attendance patterns should have been reached by that date. And if students have to have been enrolled for at least half the time up to the October 15th date, and they have to be, if they're in high school, registered for 75% of classes or 6 out of 8 classes. If these criteria aren't met, if a student is registered in 5 out of 8 classes, they won't be considered full-time, and the reserve will lose a portion of that funding. So it's really important that advisement happens and that there's good school community connections so that students stay enrolled, otherwise funding is cut quite quickly. If a student is part-time, the school receives part-time. There's no funding given for upgrading. All programs have to be approved by ANSI, and this often means that that the funding has to be approved by the ministry. There's been a trend, especially with the First Nations Student Success Program applications, that if the program that they're talking about matches provincial curriculum and there's momentum for provincial curriculums, they tend to get approved. I have no data on that. It's just what I've heard is happening, and I've noticed increasingly provincial curricula are coming into play. Students who enroll late aren't funded if they're not there by October 15th, and they don't include storefront programs as well, even though storefront programs are sometimes more successful than traditional school programs. Okay, so the nominal roll, the way it works. The school principal will get a printout. Now it's usually done by email. Principals must go through the school and make actual changes to that email register, either crossing out students or adding students or any changes. INAC, I should have ANSI there, will be the inputter of that information, and then the representative will actually conduct a visit on that site. So I'm going to go to the nominal roll Q&A. I will also provide you with this link. Okay, this is the nominal roll Q&A. I will give you this link in our announcements as well. And even though it has INAC in here and we know that it's now ANSI, there is excellent information here. about the rationale for why they fund the way they do, who is eligible, who's not eligible, and what happens with that funding. So those of you who are interested in doing assignments on something from the nominal roll, please do use this document. Okay, this is quite common knowledge that especially in the media and in this course actually, that there are differences because of how the province funds students and how the federal government funds First Nations students. We know that the funding formulas are different, therefore the way that the amounts are allotted is going to be different. There is a perception out there that funding levels are different. Specifically, it appears to be common knowledge that First Nations schools receive far less funding per student than provincial schools, and this probably deserves further examination. I believe that in some cases First Nations schools do receive less funding than some regions in the province, especially with our new funding formula that attaches vulnerability funding and different things like that. But in other cases, First Nations schools receive more funding per student than the neighboring or than another provincial school. So I would encourage you to listen to the accounts. I certainly believe that First Nations schools are not given enough funding for the work that they do. However, using the dollars to donuts comparison is likely not always the best way to go, because it's not likely true in every single situation. Every single band school likely has a rationale for what it is that they know that they need, and it likely ought to be treated individually. On that same note, there are large discrepancies between French schools and provincial schools, therefore French schools and First Nation schools. Our French schools have been very successful in the courts in winning arguments and cases on being underfunded for the simple argument that French students ought to receive funding for language, culture, and enculturation. And because of the particular cases that they have put through the courts, they have won significant amounts of funding, somewhere in the $15,000 to $18,000 range per student. And again, that varies depending on the region of the province. I believe that if there is this three-part argument to be made for the lack of attention for the French school divisions, similar arguments could certainly be made for funding needs for First Nations students. So please, when you're looking at funding for First Nations schools, the contexts and the specifics of every single First Nation school ought to be considered. Another issue is the whole notion of the transfer funding between a student moving from or living on reserve but attending a provincial school, or a student moving off reserve and attending provincial schools. That funding, that issue is particularly frustrating when the First Nation or the band school perceives that it is more expensive for one of their students to attend that provincial school because they're not receiving that same amount or the same cost from the federal government to pay for the tuition for the provincial school. I think I kind of confused you with that, so I'm going to repeat I'm going to rephrase that. When a student on reserve attends a non-reserve school, so let's say a student living on a reserve in central Saskatchewan lives near a provincial school in the province, the band actually has to pay tuition for that student to attend the provincial school. And the reason for that is the student is living on reserve. And so the money for that student would go from the federal government to the band school. And because the student is actually attending the provincial school, monies need to be exchanged between the band school and the provincial school. Because of the perceptions of inequality, if in that particular case there's a perception or there's an actual situation where that band school is receiving less funding per student, the band actually has to pay the amount that the provincial school charges for that student. So the provincial rate versus what the band might be getting. Now, in a situation where the complexities are multiplied because of the different funding agreements, whether it be fixed, flexible, I can't say those words, fixed, flexible, or block, depending on how monies are distributed, that disparity or that gap might be perceived to be even higher. Also, as noted in Shillikar-Stewart's paper, the fractured mirror paper, she mentioned there that many bands have accumulated debts for education on the reserve, and so they are spending a lot of money on debt repayment, which reduces their yearly amounts per student. And then this disparity of paying those debts back and then sending a student to a provincial school and having to pay the tuition on a provincial school would seem even larger. Now, the same is true if a student living off reserve wants to attend a band school. They also need to pay tuition from off reserve to the band school. So the provincial system the province would have to pay the tuition amount to the band schools, and then those same discrepancies and same issues would arise. Another interesting issue that arises is when the reserve actually doesn't have, let's say, a high school. So a student can attend the school from K to 9, for example, or K to 10, and then they have to go somewhere else for 11 and 12. And this lack of choice is an additional frustration for parents of children and for children alike on reserve. So the issues are deep, and they matter greatly, and they influence the success of our students, but I think they all need to be examined within individual contexts, and that no blanket conclusions can ever be made. This page has many links that will lead you to making your own rationales and your own arguments, and will likely lead you to understanding why I say that it's critical that we look at the context of each individual situation so that we can actually define what those discrepancies are. So what I've got here, this first link, is the funding levels from ANSI, from Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada, for K-12 education. And this was put up right around when Minister Duncan was pushing for the Federal Education Act for First Nations students, and it caused a lot of controversy, likely about, I would say about a year ago this month. This first table just has enrollments, but the second table actually has the funding breakdown using ANSI numbers per student. And so in Saskatchewan, the funding breakdown on average is $12,563 per student who lives on reserve and attends an on-reserve school. This page deserves scrutiny by you so that you can come up with your own conclusions, and there are some explanatory notes as to how this funding was arrived at. This second link is provincial funding levels. And you can take any school division and look at, let's say, for example, Living Sky, look at the budget that they received, and this is in thousands of dollars. See the comparison, compare it to others. But this doesn't say a whole lot because we don't necessarily know how many students are registered in those schools, and so we would go to this document. This document gives the actual enrollment, and so to find out the dollars per student, you would simply take the dollars in the thousands for that school division and divide it by the enrollment. Again, just like First Nation schools, the provincial funding amounts do not include capital funding, and so this would be your provincial student operating costs per pupil. All right, and I've got the funding arrangements linked there on this page as well, and we've talked about that already. Okay, so just a quick review. The enrollment closure date for the nominal roll is September 30th. That nominal roll has to be submitted on October 15th, so the principal has 15 days or around that time to go through the school and to cross off names and to add names and to ensure that students are attending. And then there's always an audit around November, and there's usually one done in the second half of the year, which influences, again, the dollars going to that school division. So to close today, I know I've given you a ton of information about First Nations funding, and I've given you no answers. All of the arguments in the media are valid. We need to support all students in the province, and we need to ensure that there's enough funding for education for all of the needs of all children. I believe that as a province, we will be successful when we can actually reflect the needs of everyone. Publicly funded education is publicly funded education for provincial students and First Nations students, and we're responsible to them all. We have the capacity, we have the responsibility to ensure that all of our students in any group are taken care of. And then I just put this last slide up. I won't speak to all of these. These are just some quick facts that describe the diversity of our population. And that concludes our presentation for this week.